Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos al canal de YouTube del Centro Sefarat Israel, que como saben es una institución pública dependiente del Ministerio de Exteriores, la Comunidad de Madrid y el Ayuntamiento de Madrid, cuyo propósito es servir de puente entre España y el mundo judío a través de la organización de actividades como la que hoy nos trae aquí. Esta conversación con James McAuley. James, thanks for being with us today. James McAuley es corresponsal del Washington Post en París, es colaborador de The New York Books Review, es doctor en Historia de Francia por la Universidad de Oxford y es autor del libro que pueden ver aquí, The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collectors and the Fall of France, que es precisamente la obra de la que vamos a hablar hoy con él, con el ánimo de repasar estos grandes nombres judíos del coleccionismo de arte en la Francia del cambio de siglo. James, first of all, I would like to ask you what the readers are going to find in your book, in this book.
So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me. It is really a pleasure to be here with you, and I very much appreciate you taking an interest in the book. So in general, my hope is that what readers will find in this book is a recreated world that was so central to essentially the definition of France's cultural patrimony and its sort of identity as a nation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that was totally destroyed and unfortunately forgotten today. The book is called The House of Fragile Things. It is essentially a kind of group biography or a portrait of a milieu, of a sort of beleaguered network of Jewish families on the eve of the Second World War, all of whom left their collections to the state as a means of seeking to give back and donate to the country that they loved, but also trying to sort of articulate and advance France's own aesthetic heritage and artistic heritage in the way that they saw. But more than that, I mean, these were not just sort of any families. These were elected members of parliament. They were great academicians. They were Jewish community leaders. They were presidents of museums. They were hugely important public figures. And together, what they built was this, essentially this house of fragile things, this sort of, this edifice of essentially, I mean, on the one hand, literally of beautiful things, of their collections, of their objects, but also it was, it's a testament to their values, this sort of passionate embrace of France and its universalism, but also their Jewishness, and showing how those two could be symbiotic, and that that the original outsiders could very much be welcomed as insiders. And that is a sensibility that was totally fractured after the war, obviously. But what I'm trying to do is to show what it was that they were building and why.
Mm-hmm. James, what can you tell us about these Jewish figures, owners of the most important art collections of France at the end of the 19th century? How did they make their fortune, and why did they decide to invest in art?
So, of course, I should say, in general, there were many different types of Jewish collectors, just as there are many different types of non-Jewish collectors. But the world that I have sought to recreate in the House of Fragile Things is essentially the banking elite from the late 19th century. So many of these families are the sons and daughters of the sort of first generation that made their fortunes in banking, and that in French is what we call the haute banque, the period of the kind of the grand banks of the 19th century. So for instance, like one of the families in the book is the Cahen d'Anvers. This is a family that co-founded what is today BNP Paribas at the time. The Rothschilds need no introduction. I have one member of their family, Beatrice de Rothschild, Beatrice Efroussi de Rothschild. The Camondos, called the Rothschilds of the East, were a Sephardic banking dynasty from Constantinople originally, and the Reinachs, who in future generations were not heavily invested in finance anymore, but whose origins were exactly that, a banking family from Germany, eventually installed in France, etc. And so that is the sort of profile of these families. But in future generations, they left the banking of their sort of ancestors behind and became heavily invested in other aspects of public life, notably politics and culture, running the boards of major museums, and running and serving in universities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's there were a diversity of careers, but that is the sort of common origin story of many of these families in the book.
Mhm. Well, you say that they are involved in museums, in a university, but what role did they play in the French society of that period? Did they have any key role in the history of France?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a point that I should underscore. So these are, unfortunately, many of the families are footnotes in stories about other people, at least to date. But I mean, the truth is they were hugely influential in just sort of public life in France in the 19th and 20th centuries. A great example is the Reinach family. Okay, so the Dreyfus affair, the sort of major social trauma of the French fin de siècle, in which a Jewish military captain was wrongly accused and convicted of treason. And it became the sort of major anti-Semitic scandal of the day, galvanizing the far right, among other things. And the Reinachs were his lead public defenders, Joseph Reinach especially, but Theodore Reinach, who's a major character in my book, as well. And the Reinachs were all députés in the French Parliament. They were Dreyfus's lead defenders, and the sort of and Theodore Reinach was the founder of a major liberal synagogue in Paris that still is around today. And so, they were, on the one hand, they were always proud, proud Jews who never sought to, abandon their identity, but also avowed French Republicans who were deeply invested in bridging the gap between those two things and showing that, in fact, they were symbiotic extensions of each other, or could be. The Rothschilds, of course, hugely influential in public life. It really needs no introduction. Alphonse de Rothschild at the time had so many sort of political roles, including in the Franco-Prussian War. The Camondos were less politically invested, but were hugely important in terms of cultural philanthropy. The list goes on. So they were quite known. They were during the time, like in Paris, in the fin de siècle, these were names that people would have recognized, and that unfortunately after the war have sort of fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, well, we cannot forget that this family suffered a harsh anti-Semitism during this period that increased as time went by, and the Second World War seems closer. How did they react to it?
How did they react to the
anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It's obviously complicated, and it sort of depends on the person, because it's a deeply intimate experience, I think we can say. But in general, what I try to show, two things. So on the one hand, one of the arguments I make in the book is that it's often forgotten. I think in the long and horrible history of anti-Semitism in Europe, the tendency, especially given the trauma of the 1940s and the Shoah, is to assume that all previous iterations of anti-Semitism were somehow building toward that point. But I think that that way of thinking obscures the way in which anti-Semitism was different in different moments and places. And it's really important, if we're trying to get a sense of how people and how Jews lived in different moments and times, to understand the specific nature of the anti-Semitism that they faced. And what I argue in the book is that in the fin de siècle, a major strain of anti-Semitism in France was what I call material anti-Semitism or aesthetic anti-Semitism, meaning a hatred of Jews that was primarily expressed through a language of objects and things, which held that Jews were somehow aesthetically inadequate, were ersatz, and were somehow mimetic copies of French citizens, and that could never really be authentic. There was this sort of Jewish, to quote some of the leading practitioners of this hateful rhetoric, Jules and Edmond Goncourt, the diarists, there was a Jewish aesthetic, what they called fausseté, or falsity, falsehood. And my contention is that, at least on some level, many of these collections, especially, I mean, look, collecting is a deeply intimate and personal occupation, but when the collections were given to the state with the names of the families attached to them, one of the reasons was showing that, in fact, Jews could create and curate a durable and true beauty that that did not elude them, and in fact they were able to recognize and celebrate, just as their critics said they could not. So that's, on the one hand, the collections were very much a rejoinder to that sort of specific fin de siècle material anti-Semitism. On the other hand, many of these families were immigrants, at least in their origins. You know, they were from Germany, or in the case of the Quemondos, from the Ottoman Empire, and they were seen as sort of foreigners, that they could never be French, you know, in the eyes of the anti-Semites, and even of just sort of many sort of public commentators of the day. And I think that the collections as donations were, especially given what the collections were. So it was 18th century Ancien Régime art and objet d'art, you know, the what Moïse de Camondo called, you know, the apogee of the French cultural genius. So it's a means of showing that Jews could curate and also belong to this sort of longue durée of French history. And in a sense, a lot of the collections were about writing Jews into what is called France's roman national, or national novel, national narrative. And like, this is particularly true in the case of the Caen d'Anvers, who actually, instead of buying something new, they sort of restored a storied 18th century chateau outside Paris. And the point being is that, you know, the house has this sort of very elaborate, embellished history. And, you know, it played host to Voltaire and Chateaubriand, you know, the leading figures of the Enlightenment, Madame de Pompadour, the list goes on. But now it was owned and painstakingly restored by a Jewish family who had as much of a right to be there and to belong to that narrative history as did any of the other characters in its past. And so that's another very important part of the story about responding to anti-Semitism. It's on the one hand this notion of showing that Jews could in fact create an authentic beauty, but also that they belonged to the country and could be loyal custodians of its history, and could find every sense of meaning and solace in the material traces of the French past, as did any other French citizen.
Once the Second World War began, what happened with these collections? Well, you say donation, but I don't know if there was another destinations for these works. What happened with those?
So you know, it's a complicated story, of course, but on the whole, these collections had been donated to the state before the war, in many cases, like as early as the 1920s. And so as a result, they were not necessarily spoliated as were the private collections that many other Jewish families who had not yet donated their items, or who just kept it in the family, later would be. So like, for instance, the Musée Camondo was donated to the state in 1936. Or opened to the public, I should say, in 1936. And it largely survives the war more or less intact. And that's true of some of the others, although there are some horrible stories, like the archive that Theodore Reinach kept at Carolus, which he had donated to the state on his death in the 1920s, was ransacked by the Gestapo in 1943. Some of the pieces from the collections that some of the others had left to the Louvre specifically were pilfered by the ERR, the Art Task Force. And so, it's difficult, but at that point they were no longer seen as the sort of express property of these Jewish collectors. It was just in the Louvre, mixed among the other stuff that the Nazis could steal. So it's difficult to say. It's sort of a case-by-case basis, but it's also worth pointing out that some of these families did still have private collections at that time that were spoliated and destroyed. And I have a lot in the book about the Renoir portrait of Irène Cahen d'Anvers, which was the property of her daughter Béatrice de Camondo. And that was stolen by the ERR, the Nazi Art Task Force, and it passed into the hands of Hermann Goering. Eventually was returned after the war, but Béatrice de Camondo, the portrait's rightful owner, was murdered in Auschwitz. And so that's, the painting is kind of a chilling reminder of what had happened. But anyway, it's a very complicated story.
Well, as you said, many of the works that we can see right now nowadays in the French museums, and even many of those museums, such as Nissin de Camondo, are there thanks to Jewish families. Do you think the French people are aware of the contributions and the legacy of these Jewish families, of these Jewish names?
I think not enough. I think that for instance, the Musée Camondo is a really well-established site. It's a tourist attraction. It's also just a stunningly beautiful collection. If, for instance, you are an art historian or a student of the sort of Ancien Regime, it really is just one of the best places you can go and see that kind of art. But I think the truth is, for many people, the stories of the families behind these collections are unknown or not as known as they should be. And I'm struck particularly by the Reinach family in this regard. It was essentially the equivalent of the James family in the United States in the 19th century. Just this sort of the Reinach brothers in the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. They were a sort of triumvirate at the heart of intellectual life in France. It would be impossible to find three characters more sort of immersed in cultural life, the world of letters, the world of politics, you name it. They did everything. They were called the brothers Je sais tout, which means in French, I know everything, because essentially they did. And they were so influential and so central, and yet they have completely vanished. There is a foundation in Theodore Reinach's name. There's the Villa Carolus in Beaulieu-sur-Mer, but no one knows about the Reinachs. They're outside of academic scholars. And I in the course of working on this book, I remember that there had been a plaque in their honor in their kind of hometown of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is a kind of leafy suburb outside Paris in the west. And the plaque was taken down in the midst of a renovation several years ago, and it has not been put back up. And I don't know that it ever will be. And that, to me, sort of says it all.
How hard was the documentation process for this book? What did you discover, or how difficult it was?
So the research part was, I mean, it's the most fun. It's the best job in the world. I mean, reading archival documents. I mean, there's nothing that quite compares to it. I mean, it's on the one hand so mundane and tedious, and some days you just feel like you're not getting anywhere. But then truly, there are moments that just sort of electrify you and that change everything you think you knew. And it was a lot of work in the archives of the Musée Camondo, big archives like the Bibliothèque Nationale or the Archives Nationales. But the best, without question, are the private family archives. And those I got to, I mean, I'm also a journalist and sort of just used that brain set to, or that sort of brain to track these people down and to sort of politely ask them until they let me see. And that is just incredible, because then you have letters by some of these people who have vanished that really give you a sense of who and what they were and how they saw themselves and their world. And that's really what I'm trying to do with the book, is to sort of restore them to the historical record. And I got lucky in some cases. Béatrice de Camondo, for instance, the daughter of Moïse de Camondo, whose Renoir portrait was stolen, kind of became something of an obsession for me. And I really got into her story. And the highlight of the research was meeting someone whose mother, a very old man in the Paris suburbs, whose mother had known Béatrice in childhood, and who gave me 2 letters that she had written out of a slant-top desk in his apartment that he'd kept for all this time. And it just changed everything that I thought I knew about her. And it was an amazing moment.
Mm-hmm. James, recently the French government returns a clean painting, rose under the trees, to the descendants of the Austrian Jewish original owner. What do you think about this process?
I think it's great news that this is happening, and it is something that the French government thankfully takes very seriously, and since the 90s has devoted a considerable amount of attention to doing. That said, of course, there is so much more to do and so much more that we don't know. And I'm very grateful to many scholars who work in this field, especially the amazing historian Emmanuel Pollack, who is now sort of in charge of these matters at the Louvre Museum, making sure that the provenance of certain objects is known and what can be done to rectify those situations. And for those who read French and those who are interested, Emmanuel has written an amazing book about the art market under the occupation in the 1940s, which is published by Éditions Taillandier in Paris.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so James, thank you very much for being with us today and for enriching us with all this information, and good luck with this amazing book, The House of Fragile Things. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Y a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Les recordamos que pueden suscribirse al canal de YouTube del Centro Sefarat Israel y les esperamos en próximas actividades. Muchas gracias.